Welcome to the walkthrough of the frequently made mistakes for assignment 1B. First of all, please make sure you document your code thoroughly. It's not enough just to rely on the comment specifications I give you. You need to document pretty much all the code you write. Secondly, this isn't really a mistake either per se, but you don't have to put the word thread here. You can just leave it like that and the compiler can deduce the type. The try-lock method should not be checking whether mowner.get equals the current thread. That's unnecessary. You don't need to do that, so you can remove that. It'll simplify things quite a bit. Now let's turn our attention to some problems that occur in lock implementations. So this code should really be reorganized so it starts with a check in a while loop that the mowner.get equals null, and only if that's true, then call the try-lock portion in the while loop conditional expression portion. That's the portion here. We really don't need to have this temp boolean. Likewise, by rearranging the code as I suggest above, then this try-lock will disappear, and you'll, of course, check first if mowner.get equals null, and that's a way of optimizing the cache. Also, please make sure you add a call to thread yield here after you check is canceled get, and that way it'll give other threads a chance to run if they are able to run. This isn't really a mistake either. It's just something to get used to. It's probably better form, better style to use count ++ rather than count + = 1, just a more Java-esque or C++-esque way of writing that code. Down here, you don't need to have this else if check. Likewise, please revise this code so that you first check to see if mowner.get equals null before you try to call try-lock, which again is better for the cache. And this code here is unnecessary, assuming you address my comments above. That is not something you need to do. You can get rid of that while loop altogether. And then down here, this call should actually be at the end of the while loop. In this part, somewhere around, I guess it's here, rather than putting it after the loop. That doesn't make any sense. Let's take a look at some other issues with lock. This is the wrong check. You need to check to see whether the mowner.get equals thread.current thread, not whether it equals null. And you can also simplify the code down here quite a bit. There's way too much complexity here that's unnecessary. Now let's turn our attention to some problems with unlock. So you can see here that you don't want to unilaterally set mowner to null. Only do this if the count is equal to 0. So don't just set it to null all the time, because that defeats the purpose of a reentrant lock. And also, this code is unnecessary if you do the code up above properly. You don't need to do a check using compare and set. That's definitely not needed here. It's less efficient. Instead, you need to use mowner.set null as you do above, except it needs to be done in the case where mcount is equal to 0. And you also have no need to check to see if the result is in this if statement. They're just basically, if you get to the point where it's not the owner, throw the illegal monitor state exception. And also, make sure you give some kind of helpful message here that explains what went wrong. So continuing on, this is also some problems. You need to check whether the current thread equals the owner value of the atomic reference before you do anything. This code is incorrect because you're not checking for that. And then down here, it's doing these checks, but it's far too late at this point, and it's also just too complicated. And likewise, don't use compare and set. Use set, because compare and set won't do what you want if you don't have the right conditions, and you just want to unilaterally set it to null under the right circumstances. Here's some other problems with calling mowner.get and checking for null. That's not what you want to do. You want to check whether the get returns the current thread or not. That's the indication that you're on the right track or on the wrong track. And then down here, you want to use an else if or just an else, since otherwise this code will have a bug. So you need to be careful. You don't want to be doing stuff that's incorrect. And down here, this implementation is incorrect since mowner should only be set to null if acquired equals 0. So this is just decrementing it and always setting it to null. That's a mistake. And in this particular case, you can get by without using the if statement here. You can just use the else, because if it's not the right thread, then you want to throw the illegal monitor state exception. And once again, please put some the helpful diagnostics here to tell us what's going on. Continuing on, now let's turn our attention to the spin-lock HashMap manager. Make sure that you use private cancelable lock rather than reentrant spin lock. Just a good habit to get into to always use the base class or the base superclass or the abstract class or the interface and so on, rather than using an implementation or a derived class and so on, or subclass. Don't set this field here in the declaration part of the class because get Palantiri count won't be initialized properly and it's just the wrong place to do it. That call belongs in build model. But when you do build model, make sure you give the right permit count and also make sure you make a fair semaphore. You don't want to be making a non-fair semaphore, which is the default, of course. Now, there's lots of issues with calling the lock method on the spin lock. It takes a supplier, and that supplier is supposed to be the isCanceled method reference. So don't pass this code, and this will just spin forever. You want to pass in isCanceled, so it actually does something useful. And then down here, don't use put. In fact, this whole implementation is not really correct in a sense because you're getting the Palantir. You don't want to get the Palantir. You want to get the map entry and then use the corresponding set method, set value, for example, in order to set things properly. Don't use put. That's inefficient. It requires another hash lookup, and we don't need to do that if you do the code correctly. This code here doesn't need to use an atomic reference at all. I'm not really sure what its purpose is, but it's not needed. Also, don't pass is shutdown. You want to pass is canceled, not is shutdown. And in this code here, once again, you don't need to be using compare and set. I'm not sure what on earth that's trying to do, but it's unnecessary and defeats the purpose of what needs to be done here. And then also, this is something important. It's emphasized in the videos, but I'll have to emphasize it again in the class when we meet again next week. Please always unlock a lock in the finally portion of a try-finally block. Don't just unlock it naked by itself, because if an exception were to be thrown, then the lock would not be unlocked. And there's also, again, no need to use the first unlocked Palantir variable. That should just go away entirely. And please don't delete the code that was originally here. It serves a purpose to make sure that sanity check things will be throwing exceptions when the worst occurs. Let's take a look now at some other implementations of acquire. You need to have a try finally block around this entire loop. Don't have the finally part in the middle of the loop. That's the wrong place to put it. You don't need a try finally block here at all. And make sure you move the unlock method to the finally portion after you exit the for each loop. So that's just another stylistic thing that's very important to write exception safe code. Speaking of exception safe code, don't put the acquire and lock methods inside the try block. They go outside the try block. And that's because if you put them inside the try block and there's something was to go wrong with the acquisition or the lock, then the finally method would get called, the finally block would get called, and that would end up unlocking a lock that was never properly locked in the first place. Another thing, don't use the get Palantiri list here. Instead, you want to use the Palantiri entry set, or you could say get Palantiri entry set or whatever. And once again, don't use get and put. They're very inefficient, doing all these hash lookups. Instead, use the map entry that you're iterating through and just use the corresponding get key and get value or set key, set value methods. You've got to figure out which ones to use. You also don't strictly need to use the interrupted check here, but it's okay. It doesn't hurt anything. Continuing on with problems with acquire, the code below is unnecessarily inefficient because put requires another hash lookup, as we've talked about before. Once again, use the map entry stuff and set and get methods. There are ways to do this using streams, but it's a little bit tricky. So using the for each loop might be easier if you're not that facile with streams. And all this stuff calling, put and get, those are not the right things to do at all. This particular implementation is acquiring the lock by passing the wrong parameter. You want to pass a method reference to the isCanceled method. This will never break out of the loop. And so we don't want that to happen. Actually, I think it'll always return false, so it won't even run. So it's totally busted. So don't do that. And down here, don't use key set, but instead use entry set. Don't use get and replace, but instead use map entry and get and set methods, kind of what we talked about before. This lock needs to go after the for loop, and it needs to be in a finally block. And above all, don't be releasing the semaphore in the acquire method. That completely defeats the purpose of having the semaphore. So the purpose of the release method we'll talk about shortly is to release the semaphore. Some more problems with acquire. This one is doing weird things. It's acquiring the semaphore inside of the for loop, which is very bad. It's acquiring the lock inside of the for loop, which is very bad because that means that all the code up above here is actually not thread safe, which of course is a bad thing. And you need to put the unlock method into a finally block that goes after the for loop. Down here, we're talking about release again. Please check for Palantir not equal null before trying to acquire the lock. Otherwise, you could have problems because you're going to be trying to put a null Palantir back in the map, which is a bad thing. There's no need to call contains key or call get for that matter, since we're going to handle that with a call to put or replace down below. You need to make sure you check the return value of place or put if that's what you use, and only release the semaphore if it's not equal, or if it is equal to Boolean false. If the return value of replace or put is equal to Boolean false, then you can release the semaphore. Otherwise, you shouldn't do it. And there's no need to have a catch clause at all, just a finally block, and make sure that your locks are always unlocked in the finally block. And also don't call release at all unless the return value of replace or put was Boolean false. And this should also go in the finally block, although it's not as important, but it's a pretty good idea to do that. Here's some more problems with release. Make sure you put the lock method before the try block, as we've talked about before. And I recommend passing a method reference rather than the lambda expression. This code is not wrong, it's just a little bit more verbose and ugly. There's no need to have this lock acquired Boolean. There's no need to have a loop here. In fact, that's incorrect. You just need to use the HashMap replace call and check the result that it returns carefully. And you don't need this Boolean check to do the unlock if you put things in the finally block. That will always get done. And you always want to release the mutex no matter what. In this case, don't check for true as the value of the two-parameter replace, because a null can be returned, which is not the same thing as true. So you need to think more carefully about how to do this. I recommend using boolean.false, where the false is all capitalized. This was a clever approach, and at first I thought it was a good idea using the three-parameter version of replace, but I think it's actually less efficient than the two-parameter version of replace or the two-parameter version of put. So I recommend going with the two-parameter version of replace or put rather than the three-parameter version. I think the three-parameter version is going to have some extra overhead that the two-parameter version doesn't. And make sure you always unlock the lock. Don't unlock it just when replace is true. That's the release method you want to conditionally release, not the lock method. And some more problems here with release. In this case, the lock is never locked. We need to replace the use of Boolean with a lowercase b with Boolean with a capital B, and then checking to see whether it's going to be Boolean.false. And down here, this code is just all kind of mucked up. You are unlocking the lock, but it was never locked. You don't want to unlock the lock in a try block. You want to unlock it in the finally block. And then you want to make sure that you conditionally release the semaphore only if the flag is set properly, indicating that you did the update correctly. Down here, getting to the bottom, I think this is the last example of things that went awry with release. You need a try finally block here that goes kind of outside of the call to replace. This call to unlock needs to be in a finally block. It's in the wrong place. And this control logic here is, again, way too complicated. You need to have a very simple check, and you just kind of have to rearrange the code to put the try finally block kind of outside of everything. And that should make things a lot cleaner. So that's the end of the summary of frequently made mistakes for assignment 1B. Naturally, if you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to post them to Piazza or ask in class.